Episode 84 of the Fired Coaches podcast. We are excited to have Brian Rosario, excuse me, can't even say the guy's name right here. Brian Rosario, over 21 years at the Division I level on the women's basketball side. A really unique journey. He was a head coach, he was an assistant coach, he was at the NAIA level, Division I level, JUCO level, a little bit of everything. Now runs his own advisory group, BNR Advisory, where he's working with executive teams, athletic departments, nonprofits, civic organizations, helping them scale, generate revenue, but also create a impact at the end of the day. So, Brian, really appreciate you taking some time on the West Coast to sit down and join the podcast.
No, Marcus, thank you for having me. I love the content that you put out, and I love learning everyone's stories through the power of voice. So I appreciate you even asking.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said to you off air, I think you came about my on my Twitter algorithm with some of the threads you've been posting, which is really great content. Brian's on obviously LinkedIn and Twitter and things like that, but I definitely recommend checking him out, especially if you're in coaching, thinking about getting into coaching, or just even if you're an assistant right now and thinking about how can I market myself differently and to get myself into a head job. So you've been a TEDx speaker, you've done some broadcasting. I was watching a video. I think you said that you were your dad was a Clippers season ticket holder back in the day. So I guess take us back to, growing up. You said your dad was really involved with your life in terms of coaching, getting to be around the Clippers at such a young age. Like, how did that impact you, think, years later getting into coaching and athletics?
Well, I think it's exposure, right? We don't know what we don't know, and we were fortunate where the Clippers just were bad, right? And so
And, and,
to
and
get
sorry, I should have asked you, what time frame was that roughly when you guys had tickets?
yeah, this is mid to late 80s.
Okay.
So now I'm dating myself. So thank you, Marcus, for that. But no, they were just affordable. My dad was able to get that lower bowl seat, and I just remember most of the days when there's a game day, rushing home, getting the spam and rice ready for the road trip, and just being in traffic. But once we're there, it was just such a great experience. And I just told this to someone. My dad exposed me to sports. I think I can't remember not playing sports. He just kind of threw me into everything. My parents were at all the games, so very supportive. But when the transition in the coaching happened, it was because of those experiences that even allowed me to think that coaching was an option. And so, I mean, this, when you're a coach, you're in between the lines, so those Clipper games, I was just outside the lines, and it was just like, man, look at those coaches, watching Pat Riley and Gene Shue at the time, who was the coach of the Clippers, and just all these great coaches come in. I found myself gravitating towards watching them and complementing that with some of the commentary that my dad was adding more than just watching the game. So I think
Interesting.
this whole coaching thing started really from those trips to go see the Clippers.
Absolutely. That's interesting how at such a young age you were watching that. I feel like so many kids, it's even not nowadays, but even back then, right? You're watching the game and you're watching the players, but you were really focused on what was going on the bench there. You were a male practice player on the women's team at San Diego. And I guess, what did you learn from that experience, where you were going through that on a day to day? And did that help you transition into coaching in your early years?
Well, it was one of the best experiences I've ever had. I mean, it very quickly you learn that this was not normal. I had friends asking, "Wait a minute, you're the practice player for the women's team?" And Maggie Dixon. I know that's a strong name in both the men's and women's game just because of Jamie Dixon. But we were freshmen together, and we were on a boat during orientation week, and she said, "Hey, I heard we practice against guys. What do you think about that?" And I'm thinking, I don't know, I've never heard of it. So sign me up. And it was myself and another guy that we were the practice guys. And, I was the guard and he was the post. And I just found myself always gravitating towards the coach's office. Coach Marpy, Kathy Marpy was the head coach there. Eric Johnson, who's now at Denver, was the assistant. Shelly Sheets was a Colorado, Hall of Famer, and she's still at Colorado. They were all part of that staff. And just the idea that they allowed me to be part of it was the spark. I was in their office pretty much every day asking, "What are you doing?" That's film exchange. Now what's going on? We're putting together the scout. So I felt part of the game when I was just watching them play.
So do you think that, those Clipper games and seeing what's going on during a game, like that was kind of connecting the dots for you per se then, right? Like you get that opportunity at San Diego, and now you're seeing the behind the scenes stuff of what was actually going on the court.
Yeah, and I think it came from my dad. My dad was my coach. He was my first coach in all the sports. So just hearing him in those car rides home and around the dinner table, it connected to the Clippers. And then obviously, I think when I got to college, thinking I was going to be this, international businessman who gets to fly around the world, I got the coaching bud. So it stemmed from those early years, yes, but I think it just complemented the fact that my interest was a little bit in game planning, strategy, and then the implementation of teaching and execution.
You were mostly on the West Coast for most of your career, but you make your way to the Cumberlands. You're in Indiana for a little bit. You're down in Arizona, obviously still kind of per se West Coast. You're out of Cornell. So, what kind of perspective did that give you growing up, going to college in California? You were down at McNeese as well too, down in Louisiana. Moving about and getting outside of California. What was that like of you with this traveling journey of coaching?
Well, I didn't really care about where the location was. I think my passion for coaching far outweighed the hard of living away from home. We traveled when I was younger enough that I was just comfortable on the road and being away. And McNeese was the first call, and I had some other things just drop off. And Coach Marpy, she I'm in the office and she's like, "What are you doing here? I thought you were heading out to Arkansas." I said, "No, I'm back." It fell through with the MBA program and all that kind of stuff. And she said, "Well, Bridget Martin from McNeese just called me asking if you were still available." And I told her no. And I'm thinking, can you call her back?
Yeah, right.
So she calls back, I go out on a visit and I'm just like wide eyed. It was so eye opening to just being the option of being away from home. And so I was there for a year, and Coach Martin retired, and now she's the AD. She was just named AD down there. So we're all really proud of her, but it allowed me to kind of explore another route. And the people in my ear were saying, go get your education, get your master's, let basketball pay for it. So that's what got me to Cumberland, there for 4 years under Melissa Irvin, who was, she played there. So it was her alma mater. So she had that pride, and she was climbing the ranks. And when I got there, we were top 10. So for 4 years, we won some championships, but I knew I wasn't going to stay in Kentucky,
Yeah.
being a California kid. So there was an option with Dana Smith up at Cornell. And the connection there was Eric Johnson, who was at USD at the time, was a practice player for Dana at Rhode Island. So there's the connection that allowed me to really get back to Division I and be part of the Ivy League. But I never thought in my first 6 years I'd be moving further east and more to the northeast in my career. But I was open to it. I loved it. I loved expanding the reach and getting to know different club coaches and high school coaches in different areas. And then after Cornell, I had the opportunity to come back home to Loyola Marymount. I mean, in a roundabout way, I was able to get back in the West Coast Conference.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to McNeese in that first year, we always talk on I think there's a separate podcast that could be done on coaches living on the edge that first year when they're out in the real world. What was it like that for you when you were moving to McNeese? Like you said, you went there wide eyed. You're like, oh, this is awesome. Was there any challenges you had that first year, just, financially trying to find your next meal or where you were living or anything like that?
Yeah. So I was paid $16,000. I had to live in the dorm.
Okay.
And then I negotiated one meal from the cafeteria a week. So I was kind of stuffing all the fruit and everything and taking it back to the room. But, that was part of it. I don't know if we knew at the time struggle. That was just getting the start. I don't know if we had, I didn't have this thought of you're being underpaid. And at the time it was a restricted earnings coach. So I knew it was part-time pay for full-time work, but I didn't really see it that way, And then when I got to Cumberland, I went to 19.5, but they were paying for my master's degree. So I was fine.
Yeah, yeah. No, I said, it's interesting, like, people just that have never done it or see like, Nick Saban or Mike Krzyzewski, they think of something completely different. But it's like, yeah, you can go from making $1,000 a year to you get paid $5,000 the next year. And you're like, oh my gosh, I won the lottery. It's like making an extra $20,000 in coaching money.
Right.
But I guess, is this your from growing up or when you were at USD, where does the connections, because it seemed like, again, obviously people were helping you, but you were making connections really well too. Were you a little bit further ahead of the curve than people your age, just in connecting the dots of like, hey, if I'm really good here and I work really hard, like this person get me connected here, and just kind of seeing the bigger picture of how the world is a lot smaller than it seems.
Yeah, I don't think consciously. I mean, I think obviously my parents gave me the work ethic. So it's take great pride in your work. I mean, I don't know if I ever not had that, but I also don't consciously know where I got that. So I'm assuming my parents, my family unit, they're the ones who taught me that. But this was the age, before cell phones and before, I mean, we had email, but that was very early. And, it was more, I mean, I know the number 256 resumes I sent out that first year. So it wasn't like, we were able to get the decisions right away. But I had some really good people. I had the people at USD. I met some great people at McNeese that first year. So when I going to the Final Four, they just kind of hugged me and held me and introduced me to the right people. And they kind of took ownership of me of doing that. And met some great people from it. Christy Sides, who was a great coach. And it's like that first 5 years was just trying to meet the right people, and not the right people for decision making, but the right people to support this aspiration of being a coach. And I think the biggest thing that ended up working out is that I coached in the West, I coached down South, the Midwest, back East. And that's, I think now in hindsight, the connection that I'm making.
Yeah, so you come back, like you were mentioning, to Loyola Marymount, back, I should say, in California, at least. And, again, being at McNeese, at the Cumberlands in Kentucky, out at Cornell, if you had been at USD and you got a GA somewhere in California and you get on at Loyola Marymount, I mean, how different is your path? Like you said, you get out there and you see all this different types of stuff. I mean, you're making these connections. Just how different was that for you to come back and be like, again, at that time, you're 5, 6, 7 years into coaching, but to come back and have that experience of all those different places, like I know you really can't put a price on that, but really, I guess, what did you learn from going out there and then coming back? Because I feel like that's so important, and I think there's so many coaches, right, that are fearful of like, well, if I go there, do I ever come back? And all these different, kind of thoughts that get in their head. Where you're like, hey, I traveled a little bit as a kid. I'm not scared to go anywhere. Like, really, truly, what do you think that you learned outside of making those connections from those 3 stops before you came back to Loyola Marymount?
Well, I think that's tiered, right? I think the first thing I learned was that you can go anywhere and meet great people, right? Like you don't have to stay in this unit or this sphere. But Coach Marpy told me, like, I cannot hire you unless you go away and become a coach. Part of that was just being so close to the program and the athletes and the coaches. But I think the experience of quote unquote going away to become a coach, it allowed me to align with 3 different levels, 3 different regions of the country, 3 very different head coaches and their approach to the game. So I think when I did bounce back to Loyola Marymount, I was able to give something that, someone from the West Coast who stayed on the West Coast, wouldn't be able to offer. And some of that was the recruits, some of that was the, expanding the reach of what Loyola Marymount can get, in terms of recruiting. Yeah, I don't know if there's a price tag, but I think it's build to experience.
You mentioned as well too in one of your responses, you're talking about the Final Four, and obviously to this day, right, whether it's the women's or the men's side, just how important it is to get out and be able to meet people, connect, go to the convention, all those things. Just something I had asked or I wanted to ask you on here. Being that you work with athletic departments and obviously having 21 years the Division One level, along with other experiences in college coaching. In today's world, is it imperative to have an agent or some type of connector for jobs, or do you still think that somebody who's grinding away as an assistant at Loyola Marymount, if they're doing the right things, again, you talk about building a brand, which we can talk about here in a little bit too. Is there ways where you naturally can go and get a job, or with search firms and everything, do you need to be on somebody's radar outside of just doing it yourself, I guess?
So here's
And
the
I know that's a
answer, right?
loaded question.
Yeah, no, I think if you do it a certain way, and this is why I started this advisory group, is really to help educate whether head coaches, I'm working with head coaches, but also assistant coaches on developing what does the plan need to look like. And this is what I spoke at the Final Four a couple years ago about two very distinct mindsets. One is the upper out theory, which comes from a Forbes study where they studied middle managers. And if the middle manager used the upper out theory, which means I'm going to ask for promotion and raises, or I'm going to test the market, far outweighed the return than the ones who just stayed in their silo. And so I think coaches need to understand that in order to really move up in the ladder, but then get the return of your experience, you have to be open to movement. You have to be open to opportunities, and you don't know where that's going to lead unless you lay down what is your 10-year plan? And I think often we don't know that. No one's taught how to develop that, but also what does strategic networking need to look like? I was trying to get a circle of friends and a circle of supporters early. Is that wrong? Is that right? I don't know. But I think when you do it strategically and you try to get connected to decision makers, so if you want to be a head coach, that's ADs,
Hmm.
that's search firms. If you want to move up levels, those are the head coaches. They're the ones making the decision. But I think if you have genuine relationships and they know who you are and you are top of mind when they have opportunity, what's the agent going to do that's different outside of look at a contract
Sure.
and make sure the contracts, I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So I don't think you need one. I had one. Nothing happened. I was still runner up on a lot of positions with or without him. But also, what got me into those rooms was the pedigree and my connections to those spheres. So I don't think you need one. I think it's more mental. Just I got an agent. I know they're fishing. But if you're doing what you need to do throughout the course of the year, setting up that next moving season, I don't. I think it's the relationships in the end.
And I really do think that you went about that the right way. Again, maybe you didn't know that, but again, I think when you're younger, it's who can I get that can support me, right? Where I have this true network as opposed to shaking 500 people's hands and trying to get phone numbers and try to stay in
Right.
touch maybe once a year, right? Kind of thing. Like, I think building that, base and then branching out from there. It's interesting too, what you brought up. I talked about this once recently on another podcast here, but Luke Falk, who was a starting quarterback at Washington State for Mike Leach years ago, had just written a book and talked about how he made the mistake of he was at I think it was the combine, and there were all these coaches there and analysts and assistants and all these different things. And he said it wasn't that he disrespected, but he didn't give the right type of credibility to like Kevin O'Connell, who's now the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. There was a few other head coaches who at that time were like quality control guys, right? Small
Mhm.
peanuts. They were in it, but they didn't have a title. And he said, well, looking at it years later, right? All these guys are now heavy decision makers. And so I think that's a real thing within coaching too, where it's like, whether it's assistant coaches, assistant ADs, all these people that don't have a top of the mountain title at some point, right? Or most of them are going to if they stay in it. So I think it's smart to just, right, be able to build a genuine relationship because down the road, 10, 15 years, all those people are going to have primary titles.
Well, I think you're doing two things at one time. One is you got to be great at your current job in order to get the next one, and a lot of that is swallowing some ego and just have pride in the work that you're given. Like do that first, but at the same time, you do have to branch out and start creating relationships with the decision makers because oftentimes we gatekeep ourselves. Right. I don't want to talk to the AD because that's my head coach's boss type of thing. And, or, reach out to other head coaches that you just want to pick their brain on certain areas in order to then provide, the responsibility back to your head coach. But in doing all of that, you start expanding your network. You start, digging deeper with your decision makers. And in the end, it's just a simple call. Hey, what do you think about me with that position? It's very simple, yes or no. But if you do the work, I think more of it is going to be exploratory and discovery where they're going to give you the interview. Now, how you get the interview or nail the interview, that's up to the work that you've done. Are
Right.
you ready for the work that you're about to be given, which it should be different than what you just did?
Yeah. Interesting. We've talked, obviously a little bit of your career and I want to finish on that, but all the stuff that you're doing now. And again, I think you have a great perspective on, it doesn't matter if it's women's basketball or tennis or football or whatever sport it is, right? It's all very similar, especially at the collegiate level. Where did you see all of this? Is this a reflecting point when you got out of it, just a little over a year ago? Obviously, there's a short time frame where you were out of the game coaching, at least at the collegiate level. Was it any reflection time that you did, or is this always stuff that's just been building in your mind that you're like, hey, like, people need this information or could use this talk or athletic departments or whoever that's out there? Is it just something that's always been building as you've gone along your coaching route?
Well, this is the Fired Coaches podcast, right? So I think, every time you are told no, I look at it as I was just fired from a job I just never had. Or if you're working on a staff where the staff is let go and they're doing a coaching change. And I've gone through two of those, well, three of them really in my entire profession. And each one, there was a little bit of a reflection, but more importantly, I started going in a different direction with mindset. After LMU, after we were let go from LMU, I wanted to I have aspirations to run for office, but I also wanted to start my own business at some point. It's always been kind of the plan. And so I had the opportunity to be a government affairs director for a chamber of commerce right after LMU. So that then sparked major gift fundraising for, a nonprofit in Indiana, doing legislative work on campaigns and public affairs work within the community of Indianapolis. I get the head coaching job at Chandler Gilbert when we moved to Arizona, but I was also fundraising for a local Catholic school. So the mindset was always growth. But what I was trying to do is connect the dots of a skill set and how I can apply it to where the struggle is. So when I got to Pepperdine, NIL, that's on the verge of happening. The transfer portal, money is going to be important because I didn't think athletic departments were fundraising at the level that campaigns do, nonprofits do, individuals do in terms of like running a national campaign. So I started thinking, well, what can we apply from some of those systems to athletics, but more importantly, to our program? And so starting to apply that and test it and experiment, and then to Long Beach State and whatnot. But those pivots created just a different mindset. And I think I know that's a long roundabout way. It's on my mind prior to the need, but it's only because that pivot came a little before the time. So NIL, my pivot came before that. So I was able to prepare for it. And now programs, whether it's football, men's basketball, women's basketball, all the talk is about fundraising and how to expand donors and how to manage a roster, which is kind of the mindset that I was kind of on maybe 8 years ago, 7 years ago. So it's all coming together. And then, when I did go for my alma mater, San Diego wasn't picked, but I knew it was a major point that was my goal. I wanted to coach at my alma mater. And if I'm not going to be able to, here's the pivot. And so the pivot was then starting this advisory firm and doing research. I called 100 ADs and 100 head coaches and asked where's the issues? Where's your problems? Where's the upstream, right? And just to get the content and the perspective of where my mind was going. So it just confirmed where it was going. And now it's the major pivot point and, being able to move forward with this lens.
I love your perspective and your growth mindset because again, like, right, growth mindset, such a buzzword. But to me, I think there's so few of people, not to put a blanket on it within coaching, but some people coach and that's all they do, right? That's all they know how to do. They can coach. Sure, you can throw recruiting in there because that goes hand in hand, but there's not much else they can do. And
Right.
so I love that, you've taken some things where it's like, hey, LMU didn't work out, but actually I got this real interest doing this. And now I'm going to go add these tools and actually be able to show that I can do these at a high level, whether it's, again, that's running for an office position or again, like you mentioned, the fundraising, which goes to, it's like communication. If you can fundraise, you can go wherever you can go. If you can communicate at a high level, you can do a lot of different jobs. So I love that there's an interest that way. And obviously that helps with what you do nowadays. Talk about your time at Chandler. You were talking about that a little bit when you're the head coach at Chandler Gilbert Community College. You're there 3 years. You have some really great success. I mean, I think that last year you had 16 wins. You're in the playoffs. You're ranked nationally. Your opportunity to kind of run your own program. Yeah, it's a community college, but to me, again, the level doesn't matter, right? It's what you're doing and where you're at and where your feet are at. So building that program, I mean, just talk about the experience of you getting to run your own program. I mean, like you said, you're doing a secondary job. You're fundraising for a Catholic school as well, too. So you obviously had a lot of different buckets going on at one time.
Yeah, it was a great experience. I love the people there. Russ Luce was the head baseball coach, associate, Ed Yeager, who is the person who hired me as the athletic director. And they just gave a shot to someone who was moving to the state. And so I think it was my entire career balled up into an experiment. And what I really wanted to experiment is how can we disrupt what has already been done within that conference, within that state and region that hasn't been done before. And so we started doing that. We started recruiting in areas that a lot of coaches weren't going into. Now, maybe certain players were coming down to Phoenix to play, but people weren't recruiting it hard. I went to the reservations. I recruited the, players that didn't even think they can go to college and play. And from them and the complementary of other players, we were able to make a run for championships. To me, it was kind of the culmination of a career of experimenting, recruiting, experimenting, X's and O's. Obviously, we have to adapt and everything. But most of all, it was the community outreach that I was bringing from some of that, public affairs and fundraising into the picture. And we were able to, offset a lot of the budgetary costs that I think a lot of coaches struggle with. So we were able to open that up. But I think it goes back to what I'm really trying to push now is if you want to move, you got to move within 2 to 3 years. So I put that 2 to 3 year clock on myself so that by year 3, we had results that wasn't seen in a decade.
Interesting. It's about 7 years later you joined the Pepperdine staff. I think that was a brand new staff with Kristen Dowling, who had been, I think, a GA and assistant there prior at Pepperdine. And it was 7 years since you had obviously left Loyola Marymount in the Division One level. Getting back there, how much of a different coach were you? And I know that's okay. 7 years, Marcus. This guy's been doing all these different things. Obviously, he's gonna be a better person. But just the perspective of you coming back into Division One, coming back to California, basically 7 years after Loyola Marymount. Just how much more prepared did you feel jumping on that staff there?
I mean, the confidence in the preparation is really years served, right? Being able to observe I've had so much respect for what Kelly Graves started at Gonzaga and Lisa Fortier is currently doing that, they were the North Star. Everything had to go through Gonzaga and then eventually BYU that popped into the league, about 6 years prior. So what we did was we built the team not focused on anyone else except for Gonzaga. So we had to get taller. We had to get more refined with skill sets. Our offense and defense had to match some of the pace and play that they were doing. And that took a while because, this was a little before the portal. So we couldn't turn over the roster fast. So we had to wait for young players to graduate. And then, everything really came together in that last year, I thought, in terms of our style of play, who we recruited and what they did on the court for the program. And we were able to do things that, Pepperdine wasn't successful in previous years, whether that's beating BYU at BYU, sweeping the last weekend, getting a win in the tournament, or being up by, 9 at Gonzaga at halftime. I think it was the culmination of understanding the conference, understanding the leaders of the conference, and building a team to match that first.
What was it like? And again, this is just a classic Midwest Wisconsin guy has to ask the question. What was it like recruiting kids to Pepperdine? The talk of like how beautiful the campus is at Pepperdine.
Well, we made sure that anytime we had a visit and the family and the student athlete is looking at the ocean, that we literally turn them around and say, this is what you have to get used to looking at is the academic halls, the gym, all of that. So Pepperdine's easy to recruit to, but what we were trying to figure out is, will those athletes be successful on campus within the mission of Pepperdine, along with the right dedication to what we were trying to do on the court? And so we were a lot of times weeding people out as opposed to having to get them there.
Sure. That makes sense. I think it was the end of year 4, Coach Dowling had stepped down. You were the acting head coach at the end of that last season there. Again, you had kind of talk about what you went through at Loyola Marymount, how you've used all these different things, whether it's not getting a job, whether it's, a staff being let go, like you've used it as a learning experience, which I think so many people miss that opportunity so many times. When that happened, what was kind of going through your head at that point? I mean, was it all over again, like Loyola Marymount, or was it just that you're just going to kind of pivot and figure out and use the experiences as best as you can moving forward?
Well, I think I played that whole situation wrong. I was on paternity leave going into the decision of Coach Dowling stepping away. So I was watching from afar what the team was doing, how they were performing, dynamics and whatnot. So I felt like that was a little bit of a reset. So when Coach stepped away, I was able to kind of step forward into something and kind of knew the direction we needed to go. A lot of it was just because I was the recruiting coordinator and I knew where these players needed to be on the court in order to perform. It was at BYU that, all the tension came to a head. I mean, I remember, shoot around, everyone's flat. And I remember that whole trip, everyone was just kind of like just in a daze and frustrated and, shooter, like the warm up, people just weren't engaged. Our player, like you could just read it in the eyes. And in our pregame talk, it hit me, just the pressure of that year and having to keep everything together, whether it was the players and the staff and, admin is kind of keeping a watchful eye on us. And, I went off in the locker room saying that, hey, you guys aren't alone. Like, we're going through it too as coaches. We're frustrated. Like, we feel the pressure. There's tension with us. And, I'm kind of getting emotional and I just kind of storm out. I go to the sideline. They get their break, they run out, but every player kind of tapped me on the shoulder, and we go on and win that game. And so I think part of the situation allowed me to kind of stay neutral and stay local. Where I think it hurt me is no one knew I wanted the job if it became open. I was walking that tightrope of protecting Coach Dowling, trying to keep everyone together and move forward, but also set them up for the future. We didn't know what Potts was going to do at the end of the year. We didn't know if he was going to retain her. If there's going to be a change, whether it's internally or externally. And, no one knew. So it wasn't until after the season, he calls me into the office and he said, "Hey, like, what's your intent? Do you want the job?" Because now it was gonna be open. And I said, "Yeah, I want the job." And he goes, "Well, I didn't know." But no one knew. Even the players didn't know. And so if I played it differently, I think I would let people know so that now all the eyes are evaluating me as the head coach as opposed to supporting me keeping everything together. Because when I didn't get that job, I was hurting, man. I went into my hole, didn't talk to anybody. I felt like what other job could I have done in that situation? So I felt like my career was over. Like I thought I was shot. I couldn't get another job. I had 3 kids and a wife, all that stuff. And so I didn't know where I was going to go. But Amy Wright got the Long Beach State job and hired me, needed someone from California and someone with experience. And I tell you, man, it was the best reset, but also affirmation that I needed for a career, because that next year, whether it was officials, recruits, coaches, they said, "Man, you did a great job." And not that I need that, but you kind of need it. Like
Oh
you,
yeah,
you
yeah.
need it,
Right.
And so the last 2 years of my quote unquote coaching career were some of the greatest moments just because of being a mentor to young coaches, allowing to be a kickstand to our head coach and to stay local where, I kind of started my career in Southern California.
Yeah, and then that second year, I mean, you guys were over 500. You're 12-8 in the league. Like you had a really good finish at Long Beach State in that second year. I appreciate you telling your story too about Pepperdine because I think and again, this is as we were talking about off air, the theme, right? That everybody goes through some experience, and there's a lot of these that are different, and there's a lot of these that are similar. But to me, and I've never coached at the Division 1 level. I've never coached in an interim situation. But to me, it's like that would be the ultimate like what if afterwards. The hindsight's 2020 because like whatever move you make, you don't know if it's the right one, right? Like, do
Mhm.
I tell people like, hey, I really want this, and now there's more watchful eyes, and everything I do is going to be critiqued to the greatest degree, or do I just, like you said, keep it together, try to finish the best way, do a good job, and then it's like, well, we didn't know you wanted this, and now it's like,
Yeah.
well, it's like, I don't know what the best answer is, and maybe I need to get an AD on here that's had interim coaches before to get some insight too, because I think that's one of the toughest situations you can be in, because and even in the world today, as you've seen, I'm sure you work with people. There's interims out there that you would think no way in hell are they going to get the job, and they get the job. And then you would
Mhm.
think interims that it's like it's a slam dunk, they just turn the thing around and it's a wide open process and they go somewhere else. So it's like I think that's one of the most confusing because to me it's like coaching Division 3 basketball. Every Division 3 institution has a different mantra. Do they want to win? Do they want enrollment? Do they want fundraising dollars? What's graduation rate? There's just all these different things, and each one's so different that I don't know if that's the same situation, but I really feel like that's a tough predicament to be in. When you're the interim and you're like, what do I do here?
Well, and I think that's in hindsight, talked about hindsight. I'm a man of faith. I'm Catholic, and I think you have to have faith if you're going to do this kind of business, right? Like literally everyone's eyeballs was on athletics. Like this is the shiny. Everyone wants to either be a coach or a former player. Like, you know, people's heads turn when someone says, "Oh, you've coached," type of thing, right? Like it's a thing.
Well, and even if you're not a coach or a player, you're just a fan. You want to be a part of a winner, right? Everybody wants to grab onto something, right?
That's right. And I think it's such a role. I don't care what level you're on. If you're a head coach at the college level, you're in the Senate, right? It's less people. You have the chair. If you're one of the assistants, you're the House of Representatives. There's a bunch of us. But I think if you have the ability to experiment standing on the sideline as opposed to sitting on the sideline. So if you can be a head coach somewhere, acting head coach, if you get the opportunity that I did, I mean, I think you should make it known. Now, my situation was a little different. We didn't know if our head coach was coming back. So that was a little bit of the protection. And I couldn't really tell anybody that what my aspirations are. But if I did it right 6 years prior, everyone would have known Brian wants that job. So then my vetting would have been in public as opposed to on paper behind a closed doors with a committee. And so it goes back to the previous, conversation where I think if you do it the right way and the right people in terms of the decision makers on your path to your 10-year goal all know your aspirations, you don't really have to state it afterwards and it be, wow, we're surprised that you want the job.
Does this tie in at all to, again, like I told you, how you came about my Twitter algorithm and you're in there and you're with the threads? Does this come about any way of talking about how you're branding as an assistant coach? Like, does this tie into that at all?
Everything. I think I'm going to say coaches in general, because I know there's coaches who are head coaches that want to make the move up, right? Or they're first time head coaches and they are working for their next contract extension. And I think that's what coaches, mainly assistants, have to understand. You're there to help the head coach get the extension. This is their dream job. This is their role. And so what is your brand going to be? Is your brand going to be you were the disruptor, you got in there and now they lose? Are you going to be the person who gets in there and answers the call of the head coach and gets them the extension? I think that is a much better conversation than who you recruited, who you developed, and what award they got. Like, I'd much rather say, you know what? I got every one of my head coaches, I got them an extension. I'm good at what I do.
Yeah.
And here's my focus.
That's
right.
I love that. I love that point, right? Because every resume is all-time leading scorer, first team all conference, right? What's it matter, right? Everybody's got those.
Head coach closed the deal. Head coach gave you the opportunity to develop them, and they got the award. So it's like, why are we claiming that? But I think like basketball staffs, they're the only ones who know what happens internally, right? Whether it's closed door meetings, practice frustrations, the tough win, the tough loss, they're the only ones who really know. Right. And so that becomes the brand internally. And I think if you do the right outreach, if you're connected to the right people, the brand then expands and it becomes who you are. I've been very fortunate where I believe I was mentored by the right people to put the right perspective, because I think now, and I hear this from head coaches, assistant coaches aren't prepared for the current job of today's landscape. So most assistants are just there to wear the button. And so what are you really doing to move the needle on everything now head coaches have to worry about? It's not the X's and O's. It's not the recruiting. Recruiting is going to happen. There's a bunch of kids, whether in the portal or from high school, right? There's going to be recruiting. X's and O's development, part of it. Who's going to help fundraise? Who's going to help with community outreach? Who's going to help the head coach with, anything that happens like crisis management? Who's going to help the head coach with that stuff? Be great at that stuff. Because now the pressures of a head coaches, football is a big testament of this. They're firing coaches after year 2 and 3. So that's where I go in terms of what is going to be your brand, because that then becomes the brand until you're the head coach. And now you have the numbers and data behind you. All we have is our brand right now. We don't have any data behind us.
I love that perspective. I mean, that's so true. And I guess maybe even thoughts that maybe I had, again, how do you separate yourself? It's like, well, I'm great at fundraising. I'm great at crisis management. I'm great at event management. I'm great at, right, all these things that, like you said, X's and O's in recruiting, they're going to happen. That's a staple of the job. Like, I guess not to steal all your thunder, because again, I'm going to share obviously your Twitter on this episode and hope everybody goes and follows you, because again, your threads have been awesome. But, and I think you shared this on there already on Twitter, but what would you say to the person who's that assistant who's maybe I'm just going to put my head down and work and they're going to find me, right? And I don't want to put myself out there because my head coach might think different of me, or the AD might be like, what are you doing? Like, you're trying to, outshine the person that's working here as the head coach. Like, how do you separate yourself where you're trying to build that brand and let people be known? Or is it as simple as just building that quality relationship of people in your community and then just seeing you rise over time? Like how do you do that?
There's so many people who want this job, right? They want to coach. There's so many. I mean, you go to the Final Fours or the championship games of any sport, there are people looking to either move up the ladder, go from high school to college, move up the different divisions, or from now, different sports, or from abroad. They all want this job. So I hope they turn up the volume on this one, because sitting back just doesn't work. It doesn't work. I mean, I'm a Gen Xer. Keep your head down, be loyal, you will be rewarded. I was rewarded with a long, sustained career. In hindsight, that's the most important. But I didn't really get my shot.
Mhm.
And so I think you have to have strategy to navigate this career, just because it is now a career that people want. Back, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, who were they hiring? They were hiring the gym teacher in high school. They were hiring, they were trying to figure it out. Now there's career coaches who want these jobs. And so sitting back just doesn't, I don't think it works. I think you have to align with people that allow you to be who you are. You got to be with people who allow you to be able to shout from the mountaintops of what you're all about and the direction you want to go. But more importantly, you got to align with people who support what you want to become. Amy Wright was the first head coach that I ever worked for. This is 20 years in, that made me say, I want to be a head coach. And she was all about putting me in a position to become it. No offense to all the other ones, they just didn't support it because they didn't want to lose me. And so there's that fine line where I believe this upper out theory works for both assistants and head coaches. Assistants, because you're moving around, getting the opportunities and experience that you deserve, that you should have for a high return. But it also allows head coaches to have healthy turnover on staff. So new perspectives come in, new skill sets, new reach, and new opportunities from just someone else who's coming in to take the mantle or the torch from who left. So I think it works on both levels. And I think right now, because of the high interest of this job, but the low capacity of doing the job well, that's the only way you can incrementally get better as a staff.
Yeah, we've
So,
talked we've
yeah,
talked about it on here too. Yeah, I can't remember. It was one of the more recent ones that how, I think that coaches, right, it should be their, I don't say their job duty, but to enhance and educate and coach up their coaches, right? But like to your point, I think there's so many of them that if I got somebody doing a really good job, it's easy to push somebody out the door if they're not doing a good job. But if they're doing a good job, it's like, well, I don't want to I don't want to do too much here because they're doing a good job and they're helping me, right? As opposed to, no, I should really want to give them more responsibility, get them, it's in the back end, it's almost like one of those karma things, I think. If this
yeah.
person goes on, it's only going to help me that much more. They're going to send me, if they know of anybody in the industry that's up and coming, hey, go work for that person. They gave me a great opportunity, right? Like, I think so many people are more, I don't want to say scared by it, right? But you're just kind of afraid of like, well, if I lose this person, like that could be bad. But it should be, no, I want this person.
But if they're the right people, then reward with pay and title, right? Like, I don't know if the associate head coach has the weight that it used to,
Because
right?
now it's just like handed out like crazy.
Yeah, associate head coach either means one, you've been a head coach, or two, yes, internally, we're trying to set you up to be a head coach. But then why does 8 people on your staff have the same title, right? But I think it stems from the recruiting coordinator didn't matter anymore. That used to be like gold. Like, we all tried to strive to be the recruiting coordinator. But I think you can do it with pay and responsibilities, because right now, because you asked, in a the prep email, you asked like, what rules would I change? I'd get rid of summer. No more summer workouts. And here's why. Because staffs they don't have the time to do a deep dive on like a retreat, fixing, adjusting, having some time to breathe, right? Because the minute their last game happens, they got to worry about who's transferring. Then they're trying to figure out who's going to be in the portal. Portal opens. Now everyone's doing that. Oh, by the way, your kids have workouts and or they're graduating and leaving for the summer or for their summer. And then you have maybe a day, a week to just have it to yourself, but you're not doing it with your staff because you need it for yourself. Now the kids are coming back. So you're in full blown practice. And then on the back end of summer, you don't really have that much time to meet again because now you've already had summer. So what are you really adjusting? And so I think coaches need time. I think they just need to relax, because this is high scale, high level, high performing position now more than ever because the money's involved.
Yeah.
And with more money, more problems, and more problems, like everyone's, so.
Well, and like Chris Peterson said, there was a podcast I'd shared that he had done about a year ago that basically said, how so many coaches, they don't have somebody to coach them either, right? So not to mention, like you said, they don't have time for themselves. They don't have time to sit back and just reflect on their own. They have no chance to have anybody, help point out weaknesses or ways they can get better. It's just survival mode, really, at this point.
Yeah. Well, like back in the day, the recruiting coordinator was rewarded because of loyalty in length of time, right? Time served. But that person was the gatekeeper to the head coach, kept the staff in line, right? Like that was a very important role for the head coach because the head coach doesn't need to hear it all. But that role of the assistant, old school, was the most important. It kept people together, kept people motivated, protected the head coach, and then we got rid of that. And then the associate coach, you would think, would be that role, but they never served that role. Now we're seeing GMs come in and they're the masters of hopefully the money coming in, but also the roster management. But now I'm starting to see the role of chief of staff. But
Mm.
is the chief of staff actually going to be the chief of staff? Because the chief of staff should be like the recruiting coordinator was 20 years ago. Why does the president have a chief of staff? Why do high level military have deputies? Why does the medical office or business have a gatekeeper? Because that's the most important role to the successes of the aspirations and goals of a head coach, but also the accountability of the staff. And that's what I love doing now. And that's what I serve because that's what I've served as my entire career. And so I think it's going to be interesting to watch these titles and if it's the actual role the title should perform.
No, I love that. And I don't want to speak again, not a black and white, not a completely thing, but to me, I see it where the associate things have popped up so much more, at least at the smaller level, where it's more of like, okay, this person's been an assistant so long, they want to be a head coach. We're just going to give them the title to hopefully help them. And in some ways, I think some athletic directors actually take more value in that, which, whatever, that's a topic for a different day. But to me, it's not so much earned anymore. It's just like, oh, we'll just give it to them. They've been trying for a long time and they haven't been able to get a job. But yeah, you're right. And it's interesting. I would love to be in some of those boardrooms or those meetings with you when you kind of outline the way you did just in the medical and military terms of like, hey, how does this report? And people got to be like, that's a good point. This doesn't really make a lot
Yeah.
of sense the way we have this organized here.
Well, in the end, it's can we tear back the layers and then focus on wins? I mean, in the end, that's why we all got in it, right? Like we want to just win games. We want to do it with a great set of people, whether it's staff or players, and just coach basketball. But because of the money, because of the high, I mean, there are so many advertisers that want in now, so many donors want in now that you got to do it a certain way. And I don't know if that way was ever taught to us. We're trying to figure it out. But I also think being in the boardroom, being on the campaign trail and in these, strategy meetings out of the industry has allowed this perspective to be an asset and a value now back in it. So I think it's important, but I also think it's something that we're continuing most coaches to learn and how to use.
No, I love that. That's all great insight. And really, like I mentioned, everybody should jump on your Twitter. I mean, again, you're dropping great threads all the time. Just again, ways to think different. I guess, how do you get better? Obviously, your growth mindset, you've been that way since, you got into it really in terms of college and things like that. But how do you get better, in your own time? How do you reflect or how do you get better in a day to day with books or podcasts or newsletters or anything like that?
Well, I think two different distinct ways. One, my children and family, spending time with them and learning their curiosity, learning communication. And, our kids do not listen. So that's right now the mainstay. And I'm like, how do we get kids to listen on the court? And all that. So like, that's a way, but I'm really into the podcasts, right? Like I've always been a podcast fan. So anytime in the car, I'm
And
listening to podcasts.
you've done some on your own too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was able to have my own, the Net Chasers, which was really trying to explore what direction is the industry going and what's the answer to it. And here's real data. I don't know if many people know. So I may be adjusting that conversation because the more podcasts and the people I'm kind of getting connected to that are outside sports, that's where I'm kind of getting better is bringing their perspective back in because I just think athletics is a little old school still, right? Like the way we fundraise, the way we outreach, the way we put on events. I don't know if anyone's doing it right outside of football right now. They've always been uberly organized, galvanized the community, supported the community in an off season that's way longer than the weeks that they play. So that's who I've kind of been learning from more and more is professional football and the people that I have kind of connected with different personnel. whether it's the marketing side, the branding side, the management side. But right now, it's the roster configuration side.
Interesting. No, I love that. I love the perspective of bringing things in from the outside, right? That's always great. And yeah, I mean, like you said, football too, right? Like it's such a off season that you got to be able to figure out different ways to generate revenue, which I feel like,
Right.
growing up here in Packer country, like in their whole Titletown district, they figure out ways where back in the day it was great to go there for 16 games and now it's a year round experience, right? And I think everybody's trying to mimic that in some way. Well, Brian, I appreciate you jumping on. Your story is super awesome. I love all the stuff that you're doing with your advisory group. I think it's just great insight for people to think differently, and it's not just all about coaching, recruiting, right? There's so many different things going on nowadays at this level. So I really appreciate you taking some time and sitting down.
Well, I appreciate you even asking, and I think what you're doing is awesome. I'm a storyteller, you're a storyteller, and you're able to allow people to have their moment and have the mic for a little bit to tell their story. So I appreciate what you're doing for all of the coaches out there, because I think it's up and down. It's pressure. Skills have changed, and our mindset has changed, but I think what you're doing is allowing people to digest what someone went through in order to now apply it to their space and world. So I appreciate you.